When working with an athlete in a transverse plane move, they feel slower on one side of the hip, on the left in particular, compared to the right. Or if someone feels stuck in a hip during sprinting or agility work, what do I prioritize and what drills do I like? Awesome question. If you have someone who can't come out of the cut or come out of sprinting or basically produce force in an eccentric position fast, you probably got two issues going on there. One, you could have someone, let's bring my son in for this one, we're gonna get nuts, folks. You could have someone who can't dip low enough into position to then explode out of it. So you essentially minimize the stretch shortening cycle, and that's why they feel slow. Because that's really like when we're talking about athleticism, the name of the game, in my humble opinion, is maximizing the stretch shortening cycle. You have the eccentric portion, you have the amortization portion, and then you have the concentric portion. So amortization, that's when you have that stopping point to where you have that transition to producing force. If I have someone who can't get the eccentric component of that, they can't dip down out of a cut, they can't land effectively when they're sprinting, they might be missing components of the eccentric aspect of the stretch shortening cycle. So for those people, if you don't see them dipping low when they're cutting or changing direction, you probably have to work on things to do that. Some of the basic stacking stuff that I've talked about ad nauseum on previous debriefs, that's the first place to start. But if you want to get a little fancy, you can start doing some shifting-based activities. So perhaps what you're doing is some type of single leg squat where you're shifting one hip back so they can work on loading that. I also think there's a great post or a video that Daddy-O Pops Bill Hartman has on using lunges or split squats for force absorption and force production. I'll link that in the show notes as well. Definitely check him out. Where you basically talk about getting into the hip that you feel slow out of. So you start there, and then you would work on activities that work on pushing you out of that position effectively. You might use a single leg squat to help with loading. That's one of my go-tos because that really works on shifting. You could also use, in terms of a force production issue, a high box step up because it changes the angles in a manner that allow you to produce force out of that position. So those would be examples. You need to work on things where you're shifting into a hip to absorb the force, and then you need to work on shifting out of the hip to produce force. So what that would look like if we just focused on the left hip in particular. You should see the sacrum rotate to the left when you're absorbing, and then when you're producing, you're going to see it rotate away. And it's not just the sacrum, but it's really the entire spine. So anything that rotates ipsilateral to the leg that's working, that's going to help you with absorbing force so you can elicit the eccentric component of the stretch shortening cycle. And then as you rotate away, that's going to elicit the concentric force out of the stretch shortening cycle. I would start with these folks with stacking, working on shifting into position, and there's a couple drills that I like that teach that. Work on shifting out of position. I'll show you some drills that I like that as well in the show notes. And then you would just simply manipulate your activities to do that, with the hope being that eventually you get some transferability to some of the agility or sprint work. But you also have to emphasize those components with your agility and with your sprint work. So that could be where external cueing, that could be where using bands and things like that to pull people into cuts or to perturb them so they push harder out of cuts. All of that's really good stuff. If you want someone who is absolutely black belt at applying those concepts to speed and agility work, you definitely got to check out Lee Taft. I think I have a course note where I talked about some of his stuff. And then from a sprinting aspect, Derek Hansen's probably my go-to guy for that. I did a course review for him where he talked about coaching sprinting in a manner to allow for some of that transfer side to side. Definitely check out that course note as well as Derek. And I also have a couple posts where I talk about agility and speed work. I'll link those as well. But basically, to summarize this wonderful question, you need to stack first, work on shifting into the hip if you find that they lack the eccentric positioning they need to change direction or to sprint forward. And then you want to work on them producing force by shifting out of the hip that they feel slower in. And if you progress in that manner, you're essentially just taking the stretch shortening cycle, breaking it down into segments, and drilling activities that will get you the segment that your person needs.